Hello everyone, welcome to our Writers at Work Visiting Writers series. These sessions, which we open up to the creative writing community within and beyond the University of Sydney, are part of the Writers at Work unit in the Masters of Creative Writing. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the unceded lands in the northeastern area of Sydney, where I'm fortunate to live and work, and I extend my acknowledgement and respect to the peoples of the lands that you're all joining us from. I'm very pleased to welcome Julienne van Loon this evening. Julienne is the author of The Thinking Woman and 3 novels, including the Australian Vogel Award-winning Road Story. She lives in Melbourne, where she's Associate Professor with the Writing and Publishing Program at RMIT, and her latest fiction appears in Griffith Review 66, the Novella Project, and we will talk about that novella. For this event in the Writers at Work series, Experiment and Play, Part 1, I'm interested in Julienne's sustained thinking and work on the importance of play in the work of a writer. Welcome, Julienne. We're really happy to have you here with us.
Thanks, Belinda. And just want to acknowledge too that I'm coming to you from the lands, traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Eastern Kulin Nation, and want to pay and extend my respects to the elders past and present, and also to any Indigenous people who may be joining us today.
Thanks, Julienne. So just a note to the audience, maybe at about 25 past 5, half past 5, if you have questions, you might start putting them in the chat to give me a sense of when I should stop talking and include your questions. But I will give you a reminder, and thoughts and responses are welcome in the chat at any time. I do like the little thread of encouragement that pops up while we're speaking. So I was hoping, Julienne, that to start us off, you could read from the opening of the play chapter in The Thinking Woman to start introducing us to some of your ideas. Sure.
Let me just find glasses and the right page. Okay. There's 2 paragraphs. Okay, I'm ready. If I go.
Right.
So yes, this is from chapter 2 from The Thinking Woman, and it's titled Play. To be playful is to prioritise movement or diversion, to engage in behaviour characteristically lively or irregular. It is to lean towards the imaginative, sometimes the outright rebellious. The concept has long intrigued me. By way of example, I want to take you back to 1996. I was 26 and sitting in a group, a rough circle, in the mottled shade of a desert gum one searing afternoon in the remote town of Fitzroy Crossing. It was March, late summer, and I was an attendee at a small arts festival. Our group was congregated outside the local arts centre, listening to an official give a dry sort of a speech. I sat beside my friend Jackie, and on the other side of her was a woman named Rose, whom neither of us knew well at the time. The sun was beginning to sink, but it had not yet lost any of its bite, and sweat trickled freely down my temples, armpits, back, just as I was beginning to wonder how much longer this heat could go on, and how much longer I, for one, could endure it. A small movement caught my eye. It was Rose, picking up her drinking glass. I turned to see her smile and wink at me as she extracted a single ice cube from the glass, reached behind Jackie's neck, and dropped it discreetly down the back of her dress. Jackie jolted to attention and let out a sudden, unbridled squeal as she swiftly rearranged her clothing to let the ice cube free. The proceedings paused and faltered. Jackie covered her mouth. I shuddered. I'm sure my own eyes were wide with the sheer audacity of the move, and yet I couldn't help but muffle my laughter. As the official recovered his authority, I thought, how playful and childish, and how bloody lovely is Rose. We soon became good friends. Whenever I think of her now, years later, I remember that mischievous wink she gave me that first afternoon in Fitzroy Crossing, and it still makes me smile. Play, of course, is frequently inappropriate. Often it's overtly discouraged. And yet how awful life can be without it. So many of us find solace and freedom in play, however subtle, and many of us deliberately prioritise forms of work, recreation or friendship that help us to engage in it well beyond our childhood years. Early play theorist Johann Huizinga, whose book Homo Ludens from 1938 attempts to place play in a cultural and historical context, saw it as a deeply human activity. Like him, I've often wondered about its purpose and meaning, and in particular, why our opportunities for play seem to markedly diminish once we reach adulthood.
Thanks so much, Julienne. And that's a wonderful passage to read, because I think it takes us into the way in your work that you use storytelling to express quite complex ideas, which is the enjoyable aspect of it for me, apart from the ideas themselves. And there's some lovely chat coming through. So I wanted to start with some ideas in this chapter that you begin to touch on there. And this chapter is a series of conversations with Siri Hustvedt, the novelist. And in your discussion with her, you referenced the ideas of the English mid-century paediatrician and psychoanalyst Donald Winnicott and his notion of potential space. So you quote him saying, "No human being is free from the strain of relating inner and outer reality." And you say he wrote this in 1953, proposing that relief from this strain is provided by an intermediate area of experience. Can you tell us about the possibilities of this intermediate space for you, and his ideas about its origins, where it comes from, this space?
Sure. It's been much written about in psychoanalysis, of course, but, you know, Siri Hustvedt's work has been, you know, her whole body of work really has been a real source of intrigue to me. And I had read his work separate to hers prior to doing some deep thinking about Siri Hustvedt's work and the conversation I had with her. And her take on his notion of potential space as being this kind of space of intersubjectivity, this space between you and I, between myself and some kind of other. She really takes to it with this real sort of emphasis on the intersubjectivity aspect. And I think in writing as a creative practice, that's a really useful way to think of it. And it really sort of goes back all the way to, you know, if you're read in literary theory at all, I think there's a direct link here to Mikhail Bakhtin's work on the dialogic. You know, this idea that every utterance is because of another. You know, we're not just speaking into open space, we're speaking into or writing into or creating, you know, music or painting or whatever sort of artwork we're engaged in, or even just imaginative thinking. We're thinking it into this space between, and it's the potential, the kind of what really Rosie Braidotti would call the Zoe, the sort of liveliness of that space in between us that's so important, and that's sort of the seeding ground for you know, for lively new sort of work, whether it be intellectual, whether it be emotional, you know, in any of those things. So I think that's, you know, to go back to Winnicott, Winnicott relates that space, the idea of that space, right back to very, very early childhood and the relationship between the newborn child and the mother. And I think intellectually and philosophically, my own experience of early motherhood, you know, with a very small child who's coming into language, who's coming into subjectivity, you can really sense through that experience of playing with very young children that it is through play that this notion of who I am in relation to who you are really starts to form. You know, that we come into being through relation, and not, you know, not at all along the lines of, you know, the kind of individualist notion of a self fully contained and sealed off from others, whether they be our mothers or whether they be, you know, our cats or the biome in our gut. It doesn't really matter what, you know, you can relate this idea to any kind of living being or you know, form of life, really.
Wonderful. So how might this space, and I keep thinking, I've got a very vivid image in my head now of Rose with the ice cube making something happen in this intersubjective space. So how does entering this space relate to the work of writers specifically?
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because the romantic sort of notion of the writer working alone at the desk for long hours and needing to kind of, head off to the artist's retreat or whatever to not be interrupted because it's serious work and so on, and the sort of torturous, notion of the lone writer at the desk is so far removed from this kind of idea, isn't it? And I think that, we do ourselves a disservice to get too caught up in that lone genius idea. And, it's an interesting sort of paradox, but when we're in that kind of deep form of absorption, which is the creative process, and not particular to writing, but again, as I say, any kind of creative practice, whether productive or not productive, daydreaming is a perfect example of it. We are, to go back to the sort of Winnicott example, we're in this kind of in-between space that is both reality and not reality at the same time. And some of us just love it there, and I just happen to be one. We may talk about Kim Scott later. Kim Scott talks about a childhood in which he was very much immersed in drawing as a small child, and he sort of credits his love and skill and talent for writing really in this practice of constant absorption that was enabled him by sitting and drawing. But he's not, the paradox is that he might be sort of drawing alone, but he's also being, in doing that, he's being with, and in doing that, he's working into that potential space. So it's, Siri Hustvedt talks about all art practice being, as I said earlier, intersubjective. So it's this sort of, I think paradox is probably the best word for it. We are both removed and closer to this, whatever the subject is that we're dwelling on. Sometimes in trying to explain creative practice as a form of research in the institutional setting, I talk about creative practice as being a practice that moves both towards and away from knowledge at the same time, because of this strange space that we inhabit with it.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I think we do spend a lot of time as writers, and I can only speak to writing because sadly I have no other art forms. That tension of being sort of working in two modes, and the kind of individual and the collective is certainly one of those tensions, that being close to people, that needing to know people, needing to interact with them. And also that separateness that, as you say, is part of the image of the writer, and that you do need to some extent just to do the work. You need to be alone some of the time. So thinking a little bit more about Siri Hustvedt, because she is such an interesting writer and seems such a wonderful example through which to think about play. And part of the reason I loved that you wrote about her in relation to play is that she seems so serious to me. She seems so seriously intellectual, which I thought was a lovely and the same as we'll get to Kim Scott, to have such a serious writer and to think about him in relation to play. So in terms of Siri Hustvedt, as you say, she says that art is essentially intersubjective. It's always about the other, as you've explained. Could you tell us a little bit about her work and the investigations that happen in this space there between self and other?
Sure, yeah. She's interesting as a writer in that she moves across both fiction writing and non-fiction writing. She reads a lot of philosophy, and she's very immersed in the psychoanalytic tradition as well. And the psychoanalytic tradition is deeply interested in play too. And one of the things that I love about Siri Hustvedt's fiction in particular is the way that she there's two things that are interesting, I think, to look at in terms of through the lens of play. One is that she very often has mother-child relationships represented in her work, and that space of, you know, the sort of that sort of notion of I am because you are, because I am because you are, is very, very central to any explorations she's doing of parent-child relationships. And she does describe beautifully playful productions by children in her work as one of the most captivating aspects of reading her fiction for me. I'm thinking, for example, of the sorts of drawings that the children are engaged in her probably her most famous novel, What I Loved. I think that certainly reached the broadest readership. But she's also got a sort of a talent for recreating or actually inventing artworks and craft works within the fabric of her novels as well. So I'm thinking, for example, of a woman who's a complete recluse in one of her books who makes dolls that are, you know, very painstakingly hand makes dolls that are sort of caricatures of real people that she's met in her life, and then she sells them on the internet. You know, this kind of sort of little sort of microcosm that Hustvedt is making through play, through this sort of absorptive sort of practice her characters are carrying out. And then to go back to What I Loved, you know, the where that plot sort of heads in the end is an example of this sort of really the notion of dark play. You know, the child who's doing those drawings at the beginnings has died, and his sort of slightly odd and unusual friend has become a teenager, and he leads the narrator of the novel on this really quite menacing sort of journey towards the end of the book, which again is a form of play, but it's sort of switching away from that sort of innocent notion of child's play to the kinds of, you know, very quite dark and serious forms of and abusive forms of play that we can start to enact into adulthood, and certainly to test through adolescence. So that's, yeah, those inventions of hers, you know, intrigue me in her fiction. But what also intrigues me is the way that her thinking about those interactions is very much informed through this psychoanalytic lens and through this emphasis on sort of investigating intersubjectivity.
Yeah, I mean, one of my most vivid memories of What I Loved, which I read a long time ago when it came out, probably getting close to 20 years ago now, was her, not recreation, I think her invention of artworks was, I remember being utterly startling, thinking, how does she do this?
Yes.
And it's a real pleasure. It's something that you linger over, you imagine the artworks, and that kind of sort of ekphrastic mode can be a little dull sometimes in the wrong hands, but it's apart from you know, those elements about children, missing children, that dark play, it's the thing that stays with me most strongly, her own kind of playing with making another art form within the pages.
Yes. And it's interesting that she's also an art critic, so she's very heavily embedded in the New York art scene, and so she gets to see all sorts of experimental art all the time, and I'm sure that sort of infuses her own imagination with her fictional characters creating artworks within her books.
Yeah, wonderful. So in your conversations with Hustvedt, you talk about the work of Lev Vogotsky, a psychologist interested in play, and you quote him saying, "Imagination is a new formation that is not present in the very young child." So that's very interesting idea that it sort of comes to life at some point. "Like all functions of consciousness, it originally arises out of action." And then you write, "Vogotsky saw play as both cognitive and affective, intellectual and emotional. He observed the way children seek to transform ordinary everyday objects. A stick becomes a horse, and posited that this kind of active imaginary play is a means for developing abstract thought." So that's fascinating, this doing and thinking. So this idea that play is where we develop thought is a wonderfully generative idea, and I think that it surfaces in your work in various ways. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about that kind of that mechanism, for want of a better word.
Sure. One of the things about Vogotsky that has always stayed with me is he gives an example of a sort of experiment he did, you know, in thinking about play, where he asked two sisters who I think must have been about 4 years old or something like that, two children who actually were sisters in real life, and he asked them to play at being sisters. What is it, you know, can you perform for us your sisterhood, you know? And through that he sort of decided that he thought that play sort of exists in this space that's between rules and their absence. So the sisters are sort of overperforming their sisterhoodness, if you like, because they know that there are certain rules about sisterhood, and that they want to bring those, you know, to the fore. And at the same time, they are actually sisters. And so they're making it up as they go along, and they have kind of nothing to go on, and there are no other older sets of sisters for them to kind of, imitate necessarily in their household. And I was sort of struck by this notion that play, which we think of very often when we think of child's play as being free play, really, that it's actually, you know, quite deeply embedded with sets of rules. And I think that creative writing is very similar. If you think about you know, setting out to write a novel. We're setting out to write a novel because lots of people have written novels before, and we've read lots of novels, and we know what the rules of novel making actually are. And yet within that, we feel permission to shift into some sort of sense of free play, which gives us a sense of safety, and it gives us a sense of sort of being able to access that potential space in the Winnicott sort of sense, that mode of absorption. So the whole thing is sort of almost like a trick we play on ourselves, to sort of we want ourselves to forget what a novel is, so that we can go in and begin a new one, an original one. And yet at the same time, we have to keep coming back out of that, turning that trick off, if you like, in order to see, well, is it a novel? Is it working as a novel? What does a novel, what ingredients is a novel supposed to have? Oh, better go back and read some more and check the rules, and we're sort of shifting in between all the time. And I think that's, sort of paradoxically again, it's the rules, and this is what Vogotsky says, it's actually the rules that enable the creativity in a way. We don't like to think about that as often as creative artists. We sort of, get into that sort of romantic notion of, us being, again, the lone kind of genius inventing everything as we go along. But actually, that's not how it is.
Yeah, I love that image, and it suggests to me that you're playing a game, that you're entering the arena and you're playing according to certain rules. And then you're sort of almost stopping to watch a video of what you just did and critiquing it, and then going back in to play again. But with every move, you have to drop back into that space.
Yes, and to forget all over again.
Yes, almost. To forget, to pretend, to imagine, to play. That's wonderful.
You can watch children, when they're doing those role-playing games, if you're observing that, you can watch that moment of hesitancy where the inventing is going on, the reference to the rules, and then there's this moment where they just drift into that free role play of whatever kind, and the world comes to life for them, and there's almost like this visible kind of breathing out, this relaxation and kind of letting go as they drift into the forgetting.
Yeah, it's amazing. It's amazing how they don't have to be taught to do that. They just need another child. They just need another person playing with them.
Yeah.
Who's willing to play. Okay, so another of your wonderful quotes. So you quote the American neuroscientist Stuart Brown, who says that the opposite of play is not work, it's depression. And I'd like to hear about what that means for you as a writer. You might tell us about what the ideal working situation looks like for you, or what it feels like when this is working.
For me, that creative release through writing, and I think particularly fiction writing, is a source of deep well-being for me, and I've come to understand that relationship over many years of practice. There are times, as in the last few months, where I just haven't been able to reach into that space for whatever reason, for other, other obligations in the way, that kind of thing. But I notice it. I notice its absence as a practice, and I also notice when I go back to that immersive, imaginative space, the effect that it immediately has on my sense of well-being and my sort of way of being in the world, and with my people, and with myself, and all those kinds of things. So for me, it's really, really crucial. And I want to just pick up, since you mentioned it, the Stuart Brown experiment. The reason he arrives at that idea that the opposite of play is not work, it's depression, is a lab experiment, which I always feel uncomfortable in kind of relaying, but I just think it's so illustrative of the importance of risk taking. So he cites an example that somebody did with some lab rats, where certain groups were denied play and others were allowed play. And what they found was that the group that was denied play, when the scent of a cat, like a collar that had been worn by a cat, was dropped into their cage, those that had been denied play just went back to their bunkers and never came out again and died there. Whereas those that had been enabled play kept coming out to check, was it a cat or was it just the scent of a cat? Quick, run out, quick, run back in, quick, run out, quick, run back in. So there's this sort of, biological kind of imperative for, related to survival, I think, that is about the importance of taking risks in order to survive well, in order to survive fully. And I think that the creative space for me is, in an otherwise fairly law-abiding, ordinary kind of existence, a place for me to take those risks that seem important to me.
Yes, we don't have to play nice when we're writing.
No.
You write in reference to Hustvedt and thinkers like Rudolf Steiner that the body is central to play, and you say that it can be central to writing, which is an idea that's close to my heart. So in this chapter and in your novella Instructions for a Steep Decline, you home in on images of cycling. So could you tell us about that intellectual and physical state of cycling, what that might have to do with writing?
It's interesting, this relation between the body and writing. And of course, Helene Sassou is always the person that I kind of go back to when I'm thinking about this. But so for me, cycling too was a form of risk taking, that I love cycling really, really, really fast downhill. And I find that does me a great deal of good in the same way that, keeping up with my writing practice does. And, I was just reading in a book to do with the gut-mind relation last week, this kind of proposal that the reason that we have brains at all is to enable movement. And I found that quite an interesting hypothesis. I don't know to what extent it's true or not, but many writers talk about their daily routine involving running, jogging, cycling, swimming, these kinds of things. And, it feels to me like that sort of, oxygenates the brain or something like that. And we can just kind of power on into this kind of creative space when we're able to kind of, plat that sort of regular movement into our daily lives. So that really interests me, because this notion that the mind, again, is sort of this sort of 19th century idea that the mind is here and that the body is over here, or even that the mind is gendered male and the body is that's the sort of messy, bleeding body is the women's kind of area. It's just done us so much damage, I think, in terms of really thinking about human potential. So the body mind, is a word that shouldn't need a hyphen, in my view.
Yes, absolutely. If we had more time, I would get into tales of walking. But I do believe that you have to you have to look after the writer's body, and you can get away with it for a while not doing that, but the brain is part of the body and will speak back to you if you don't look after it.
And also Belinda, the writer also needs to look after their mind. And I think that sometimes in paying attention to keeping the body physically well, we forget the importance of keeping the mind mentally well as well. And, just the kind of myriad pressures that are placed on us all the time in contemporary life can be so damaging for creativity. And I think that regular forms of whatever form it takes for you, of just letting the mind come back to its kind of place of peace, is really crucial too.
Absolutely. And I like the image of cycling, because cycling seems a bit wild and playful to me, as I have a very sedate pace of exercise. So that might be a good point for us to think about your novella. And I'll just remind the audience that if they would like to start asking questions in the chat, that's fine. And then I can see how much space to leave. I'm happy to talk for a long time. So just to introduce this story to our audience, if they haven't read it, this novella is about a woman, Will, who has a cycling accident and ends up in the river. While she's unconscious, we're invited to explore her life, its memories and possibilities and attachments. It's a very intriguingly structured story. I highly commend it to you. So I am hoping that Julienne could read us the first 3 paragraphs while we're thinking about this business of cycling.
So that lovely intro, Belinda. So this is the opening to Instructions for a Steep Decline. It is peak hour in the City of Light. A woman cycles backwards up a steep incline. The woman might be travelling home or to work. Other commuters flash past her on the busy city cycle path. There are black swans on the river. A train passes on a nearby bridge. Will commutes to work in the CBD 4 days a week. She prefers the shared cycle paths along the water's edge to fighting with the traffic for space at the fringe of the highway. The river soothes her with its swans and cormorants, stilts and plovers. There is something about its broad expanse, its gentle current, that keeps her pedalling despite everything. Look again at the woman on the bicycle, Wilhelmina Blome. She has the physique of a serious cyclist, lean and angular, almost boyish. But she's not cycling backwards. How could you? Perception is only ever partial, tentative. Perception is a game. Will is moving forwards at considerable speed, and it's a steep descent.
Thank you. That's so suspenseful to leave her there. So I reread this before I talk, and I kept puzzling over that moment. A woman cycles backwards up a steep incline, which stops you almost as soon as you've begun. You think, hold on, what's this? And then very short sentence, perception is a game. And I felt quite strongly the sense of being put on notice of being in a certain kind of realm or space here. Could you tell us about what's happening?
Oh, well, first of all, this is quite a deliberately experimental narrative, and I decided when I wrote it that I was writing very much for myself, for my own pleasure in terms of the structure of the narrative, and that with other books I've sometimes felt, and I still do feel to a great degree with fiction writing, I feel a loyalty to the working class and to people outside of the intellectual system, outside of formal education. And I like to be able to think that the vast majority of my writing can speak to anybody, no matter what their background is. And so I don't like to go in for a lot of intellectual tricks and games. And yet, I do have a PhD in English. I have thought a lot about the way literature works, and I do like to play formally and experiment with it sometimes. So this was a piece in which I was just allowing myself to forget about who I was writing for and really just experiment with nonlinear narrative. And I wanted to signal to the reader in the very first part of the piece, this is not a continuous realist piece of writing. And I think that that's part of the kind of contract I have with the reader, to make that really clear right at the start. But the other thing I was experimenting with was consciousness. And I had an idea very early on for the structure of this piece, that it was going to be a circle coming, starting at one edge of the circle and going all the way around and coming back to that moment in time. And the moment in time is this moment in which the main character has an accident on her bicycle. And then we come back to her, albeit fleeting, consciousness at the end of the story, and wonder, well, was it an accident, or did she just imagine it? And so that's also sort of me trying to signal that interest in perhaps things not being as they first seem, and the notion that, with the cycling backwards uphill, is Will's perception or the narration being clear with you as a reader, but also really, I mean, the question sort of underlying the whole thing is, what is reality anyway, actually? It can be one thing one moment and a completely different thing the next. One of the key one of the incidents in my own life that lent me, sort of headed me in this direction with wanting to think about consciousness and accidents, particularly brain accidents in this way, was my brother at 18, many years ago now, had a very severe motorcycle accident, and it took him 2 years to learn to speak again. And I was fascinated that when he was deep in a coma, we were still able to speak to each other. He and I, we were quite close. And he was in this kind of nowhere land. And yet when I entered the hospital room and I said, "Hi, Nick," he said, "Oh, hi, Ju," just like it was like a normal everyday kind of interaction for the two of us. And the medical staff in the room just kind of, looked at us in this funny way. But it seemed completely natural to me that he could answer even as he wasn't present. And so I was interested in that idea, where do we go, in those kinds of states? And also, when we come back, what do we come back to, and who are we, when we return?
Yeah, so fascinating. And I would also say, just in relation to that question about who you write for and the contract with the audience, that my response to this novella was that it was fluent, compelling, completely engaging, and open to the audience, at the same time as being experimental. It didn't feel like a closed group that needed certain knowledge to be able to enjoy. It felt like a good story.
Great.
As well.
Pleased to hear that. Thank you, Belinda.
Okay, so we love to talk about reading. I certainly do, and I always my pulse quickens when I read stories and people talk about their modes of reading in them. And so in this story, there is a sort of a memory of reading within this kind of stream of consciousness, while she may or may not be unconscious. So I'll feel slightly self-conscious about it, but I'm going to read a passage of it to you. So you write, as a child, Will's imaginative world was deeply immersed in story. She read not broadly, but deeply, inhabiting the story worlds of her favourite texts with a dedication few could match. Certain environments she passed through during the day came to life for her as settings in which the characters from stories must have actually dwelt. Love that. Although the practice faded some as she grew into adolescence, she was still capable of an immersive, extended form of daydream, in which the presence of characters from novels and the cinema, or sometimes from her own writing, populated otherwise ordinary streetscapes or living rooms. And I just wondered how that account of reading relates to the kinds of spaces we've been discussing, that kind of potential space because it seems like things are overlapping and blurring there.
Mm. Yes, well, I suppose I wrote that paragraph that way because I was that child and still am that adult, you know. And I think that my, I gave the example of Kim Scott sketching as a child before as a form of absorption. And I think for me, it was just simply daydreaming. I was very good at it. It was, commented on frequently by my teachers at school, because I constantly looked like I wasn't paying them the slightest bit of attention, which I probably wasn't, but it was just what I did for whatever reason, and it still is to some extent. And the experience of my own, strangely, my own kind of fictional worlds coming to life for me at times in an otherwise ordinary day still does happen to me occasionally. And I remember one very vivid experience I had when I was writing my first novel, Road Story, and I was doing my PhD in Brisbane at that time, and I hired a little van to drive down to Wilcannia, which was a key setting, that sort of part of New South Wales anyway, was the setting for the novel, and I wanted to see it again. I hadn't seen it since I was a child. And on the way, through the back of New South Wales, my characters and I was the only one in the car, we saw the show people who appear in Road Story, which was already drafted at that point. They were driving towards us on the road, like it was an actual kind of country show kind of troupe, moving all their rides and whatever. But I understood it, driving along as my people, my characters in the book coming towards me. And it was really quite, it was actual and imagined at the same time. And the same has happened to me sometimes with that book, with Road Story, when I returned to Central Station, which is a key sort of setting for the early part of that book. I still sit there with Diana, on my mind, and sort of see her moving through that station in the state of mind that she was in at the beginning of that book. So I don't know what it is. It's just a peculiar habit, I suppose, that I love and I've never been able to give away, but it's generative for me and takes me into that, potential space zone, I suppose, that we were talking about before.
Yeah, I mean, I think too, when things are going well, or you've been with a story for a long time, or with an idea when you're writing an essay, it infiltrates all the time. And
yes.
that kind of, those overlaps, I think they intensify, and I think then that something's happening, and I think that's a wonderful place to be.
Very true, yes.
Okay, I'm going to ask you one more question about your novella, and then I want to give you one of the audience's questions. I'm just interested in the way that you think through some of your questions in different modes. So I read this novella quite close to my reading of The Thinking Woman. And I remember being enormously impressed with your productivity. There was all this stuff coming out and I thought, oh my God, how did she do it? But I understand there are quiet periods when things are not visible. So, we encourage students to work things through exegetically. So they might be working in two modes as well. And I felt that dynamic here. There were some traces in the novella of things, like the bike riding was in The Thinking Woman. And I wondered if you could tell us about the relationship between the different kinds of writing and doing here, the way you seem to ask some similar questions in different modes.
I think it was a bit of an unusual circumstance that those two books were written pretty much at the same time, and through a period where I did have quite a bit more time and space to concentrate on my writing, partly thanks to some grants from Creative Victoria and the Australia Council, but also largely due to the VC's Senior Research Fellowship I was given at RMIT. So those two books probably speak to one another more closely than many of my other texts, because I was tackling the same ideas, reading the same philosophy, and they definitely sort of grew up side by side. The fiction came first, and the writing for the thinking woman later. But I did do myself a Bachelor of Creative Arts at Wollongong straight out of school when I left high school, and went on from there to study honours and a master's by researching creative writing, and then started teaching creative writing, and then many years later went back to do my PhD. So this idea of having a research question that is the core sort of drivers, probably 2021, and it's still the way I work now. And partly because I, do work in the university institution, so I'm required to write scholarly papers and those sorts of things. But I don't think it is just kind of a function of that I do actually tend towards being interested in formal experimentation with form, but also ideas around philosophy. So I am reading and writing in both modes at once usually, but probably mostly it's the creative work I spend more time on, and then the essays alongside that will be shorter works. But I love working that way, and I think that the fiction practice, it really benefits from that. And I know there are other writers who kind of recall in horror the idea of working that way, but for me it's been such an entrenched way of doing that I've really come to depend on it in a way, for the sort of injection of ideas and liveliness that it can bring to the fiction practice.
Yeah, I mean, I think when you talk to students about the ideal project and how it works, it's that idea that they feed each other, the two parts of it. It's not a question of writing something creatively and then explaining it. It's thinking about things in different modes and allowing them to cross-fertilise. And I loved seeing that beyond the academy, and just, I don't know how much happenstance goes into publishing those things quite close together, but I really enjoyed reading those things in different places. I just want to, before we might get a little bit of time to talk about the Kim Scott essay, we'll see. If we don't, I'm happy to encourage everybody to read it, and have already set it for all my students, so they're aware of it. But Jessica Wang asks for your thoughts on play and writer's block, which seems like a good question to me. I had something similar in mind about, I think, I imagine what Jessica is asking is about ways out of writer's block, a kind of purposeful play.
Yes. Look, I think that it goes back to, my suggestion goes back to that conversation we were having earlier about rules and the absence of rules. And I think that in my experience, an answer to writer's block is constricting yourself in some way. Just, I think that, there are a lot of books around that give you little exercises to do as a writer, and, some of them are awful and some of them are great. And I think it's a good idea to just have a couple of those on your shelf that speak to you in whatever way, and just try some of those exercises that work. It's, it's a bit like doing exercises at the gym, and some of them can be ridiculous exercises. Like, I remember doing a really productive exercise once, which was to take a sentence from a book you love, and then write that sentence out, and now write a paragraph in which the first word of each sentence in your paragraph is the next word in that sentence. Like, it's just completely kind of mechanical, in a way, as an exercise. But I invented this scene. I don't think I ever would have invented otherwise. It just pushed me out of my comfort zone, gave me a puzzle or a challenge of some kind that seemed absurd. And, many iterations in the draft later, I let that sentence go. It was the generator, but it wasn't the sort of, end product. So I find those sorts of exercises, when I'm stuck, really good. But the other thing that I think is good to do is, as discussed, physical exercise. Take your ideas for a walk, and then come back and say nothing to anybody. Don't let anything else interrupt. Come straight back from your walk or your run or your cycle or whatever it is, and go back to the desk. The other thing that really enjoy, and I've got into the habit of doing with colleagues at RMIT, is Pomodoro sessions, where you just have a date with a couple of other people who've got some writing to get on with as well. And I find an hour and a half is about right for me. You can do 3 25-minute silent writing together sessions. And for some reason, just having other people there to be accountable to means you can't suddenly get up from the desk. You're in the middle of your 25 minutes, you know, and you're doing it together, and it's a project together. And then in the 5 minutes, you know, at the end of between 25 and 30 minutes, you just have a little chat about whatever, doesn't matter what. And then the timekeeper comes back and you go back into that. And so it's just another way of, it's another constraint in a way. But I think in my experience, constraints were writer's blocks, often fear of the blank page, you know, fear of the great endless potential space we were talking about before, I think.
I find sometimes, I don't know what this is, I've become, you know, very used to just typing into Word. But sometimes it's almost like I regress to the old ways of writing and just think I need to write in my notebook for a while. Something, maybe it's about the body, the ink, the physical texture, just that shift often helps as well. I think as well, it's not in the document, so it's sort of a space to play as well. Anything can happen there. It quite often gets a bit diary-like, which can work to generate things. So yeah, I think often it's just a question of changing something, just doing something different. We have another question in the chat, which I think may be our last one, actually, looking at the time. So Susanna says that she read The Thinking Woman a while ago now, so apologies if it's morphed in my mind since, as a philosophical challenge to the dominant narrative of using psychology to understand life, struggle and purpose. Would you have any reflections on this 2 years on from the book and the role of philosophy in modern life? What a fabulous question. Thank you, Susanna.
Thanks, Susanna. Yes, I do have some commentary on this. And I think, again, sadly, that some of this is gendered practice. So when I was writing The Thinking Woman, I also wrote a paper on popular feminist philosophy, because I wondered, well, what is that? Is that what I'm writing here? You know, what's it about? Anyway, I did some reading on self-help. The self-help section of the bookstore is often frequented by women, and those books are bought frequently by women. And the philosophy section of the bookstore is often frequented by men. There's a lot of male authors there, and those books sell better to men. And so there is this pattern that you could argue in a sort of cultural studies sense that women are understand themselves to be in need of correction, that those self-help books, we go to them because we feel we need, you know, someone to tell us what to do. And I think that's a real shame, and I think it's part of the kind of trap that we're in as women, you know, culturally. So I offer the philosophy section of the bookshop as a space to go to think about the meaning of life, rather than thinking about you as a person with a deficit, because you're having trouble with coming to terms with the nature of everyday life, which is full of suffering, actually, for all of us. So psychology, I think, has tended to, you know, I'm speaking in very broad terms here, I know, so apologies to the psychology graduates in the room, but psychology is really sort of part of the medical narrative, the kind of, you know, sense that if we're not happy, there must be something wrong with us. Actually, not being happy is a pretty normal state a lot of the time. And I'm not trying to sort of discount, you know, serious depression as an illness and that sort of thing. But I just think, particularly for those of us who identify as women, think about next time you're kind of wondering, well, how do I do motherhood? You know, how do I do work-life balance? Just try the philosophy section instead. And I think it's liberating. I think it's wonderful. And I really love it.
Fabulous. I might just squeeze in one last little question, because I had wanted to talk about your essay, Rhythm and Play in That Dead Man Dance by Kim Scott, which, full disclosure, you wrote for my collection on Australian writers writing on other Australian writers, because I love this reading chat. And you quote what Kim Scott says in an interview with Charlotte Wood, in which he says that the savouring of rhythm in his prose is a sensual sort of thing, closely related to singing and to dance. And I didn't want to leave us without considering play and language, which you do so beautifully in that essay. So I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about the role of rhythm as play in your own work. Perhaps when you're rewriting, do you play with the sentences in that way?
Oh yes, and you know, I think, as I say in the essay on Kim Scott's wonderful work, language is our medium. You know, it's our clay, it's our set of pastels, and you can't sort of not be, you know, terribly in awe of it and terribly fascinated by it, I think, and still, you know, still be a writer. So yes, I absolutely do. And I started off, you know, as an emerging writer, thinking that the prose poem would be my form for life, and then I gradually sort of moved to, most of my fictions are novellas. They're not, you know, great expansive novels, and that is partly because I do work over and probably too much sometimes, my work, but that is, you know, very much a result of the kind of the language play kind of aspect of writing practice. So I love that very much, but I'm very conscious too, after years of experience, that I mustn't get too caught up in that at the expense of moving on with, you know, character and plot and other aspects. So it's a double-edged sword. But again, you know, Siri Hustved's work on this is wonderful too. She talks about word salads, you know, as a form of play, and just that sort of mucking around with things that until they're sort of nonsensical almost, and then sort of moving back from that. But I think that's another, we're talking about writer's block before, another sort of way to get around writer's block, I think, is to just really go in really close and start dismantling language in a playful kind of way, and seeing what happens and seeing where it takes you.
Yeah, absolutely. When things are going well, that is a true pleasure of writing. Just I'll just sit with this sentence for now and play with that.
Yeah.
Julienne, I want to thank you for such a fascinating conversation. I can see from the chat, and I know that I'll be talking to our students in the next hour about all the ideas that brought up for us. And I hope you enjoy the easing of restrictions, the returning of play to our lives.
Thanks so much, Belinda. I really appreciate the invitation and your careful consideration of my work. It's such a privilege. So thank you.
I'm looking forward to reading more as it comes. Thanks so much, Julienne. And I will see my students in class. Have a quick break, students, 2 or 3 minutes to get a drink, and we'll rejoin. Thank you so much, Julienne. Goodbye, everyone, and thank you for coming.